Now, for the paper review, I'm delighted to be joined by Giles Kenningham. He's a former Downing Street Head of Communications under David Cameron, and he's the presenter of a new podcast called Hacks and Flacks. Giles, how are you?
Good, how are you?
Lovely to see you. Let's get straight into Raab, because you were quite fascinated by this Francis Maude op-ed in The Observer. He says, we've lost balance in the civil service. It's my job to help find it again, because he's carrying out an investigation into all of these matters. What's your reading of Raab's resignation?
Yeah, I think fundamentally the civil service does need a huge overhaul. We can't have a system where ministers are accountable for officials and everything they do, but officials aren't accountable to the minister. And I think Francis Maude is looking at this. You know, you have in America, I think they have 4,000 political appointees. In Australia, permanent secretaries are allowed to take a political position. If ministers are to actually push through some quite radical, progressive reforms, you need the political will of the party on the table. And you have seen situations where that hasn't been the case. It's done for, I think, for the past two, well, at least for one of the previous Home Secretaries, Amber Rudd. So I think it'll be interesting to see what happens. I think also you have to have a civil service where people can be fired. You know, I do remember instances when I was in government of poorly performing civil servants who were moved sideways or were promoted up to get rid of them.
For failure.
And that wouldn't happen in any other walk of life.
And in general, what's your view of Raab? I mean, did you work with him in a close capacity? Do you think he's a bully?
I didn't work with him, but look, I actually think he's probably been quite hardly done by. I suspect a lot of public sentiment will be with him. Yes, probably his manner was probably too abrupt at times. Did that actually warrant him being fired? I mean, look, we've now seen that there have been instances of what the civil servants were doing. There was certainly an example of one of the diplomats massively overreaching, didn't have a democratic mandate to do that. And also civil servants actively briefing against Raab. So is there going to be an investigation into that? You know, what's going on there?
I mean, also, you worked at Number 10. Presumably it's quite a robust atmosphere. I wouldn't imagine that during some of the fallout from the referendum campaign that you didn't have the likes of David Cameron and others being quite direct with staff. I mean, isn't there this sort of atmosphere where people's work is closely scrutinised?
I think, like the civil service in any organisation only works where there's a clear sense of decision-making, where people know what the boss thinks, and there is a sense of momentum, and you need that. Otherwise, the bureaucracy takes over.
Yeah, I think it's also interesting how it casts a light on this idea, as you say, of ministers being accountable, although we could say that ministerial responsibility has eroded somewhat since the 1980s, but also this idea that the civil service, I mean, are they impartial? There was a quote in the week saying, you know, it's just a fallacy to suggest that civil servants don't take their personal opinions to work with them. We've seen from the Sue Gray appointment that, of course, they have their own leanings. What's your view of working with these officials one-to-one?
Look, there are some brilliant civil servants, and you tend to get the best ones in Number 10, Foreign Office and Treasury. But you do have some civil servants who have an agenda, which I think is why you need more political appointees who can then help push through the minister's agenda through the department. Because think about the amount of time which is wasted fighting with the civil service to try and get your reforms through when they're blocking things. And we are living in a world now where disruption is happening a lot more, the pace of change is quicker, and so the civil service and government need to reflect that.
Well, let's go on to the next story. Policy story of the day, of course, is about migration. Braverman's on the front of the Sunday Telegraph talking about defying judges on migrants. There's also a piece in the Sunday Express quoting other Tory MPs saying, oh, well, this is where the civil service will turn next. They'll try and block her migration reforms. It does seem to be that anybody who's trying to push a controversial policy, or at least a policy that might not be popular with the left, seems to come unstuck.
Yeah, look, this, I think, is an issue which massively resonates with the public. I think the Tories have got public sentiment on their side. It's one of Rishi Sunak's 5 pledges. And I think, you know, as Braverman kind of maps out in the Telegraph today, if we are to have sovereignty as a country, then we should be able to defy the judges. So, you know, big fight gearing up, but probably a fight that I would think that she'll be relishing.
How damaging has it been for the Tories to have this accusation of 13 years and you've done nothing, boats going from 290 in 2019 to 45,000 last year? I mean, they haven't got a grip on this. You could say even the previous Tory administration didn't have a grip on it. Why is it so difficult to get this problem solved, Giles? No,
I think you're right. It has been, let's be honest, it is damaging, which is why it's one of the 5 pledges. Clearly, it's coming up in the focus groups. I think there has been an issue here. You know, for a lot of time, it was like, oh, it's too politically sensitive to talk about immigration, when actually people want an honest conversation. And it has been the case that France has basically had, I suppose, an issue of like let them go to the UK and England. And let's remember, like, someone seeking asylum or refugee is going to the first safe place. Now, often that is not the UK. That is France, and there has been a sense of them not really pulling their weight. So I do think it is something which they need to get on top of.
Is it election defining this? I mean, lots of people say if they don't stop the boats, they're not going to win in 2024.
I think it is politically, it's a hot potato and one they're going to have to get on top of.
Let's have a look at the elections. Of course, it's the local elections on May the 4th. A lot's been said about whether there are going to be some secret pacts between Labour and, say, the Greens or the Liberal Democrats. Liberal Democrats, I did describe them last week as a bit lesser spotted. Just to say, we do ask them on this show. They don't want to come on. They don't want to speak to the GB viewers or indeed listeners. OK, we hope to persuade Sir Ed Davey at some point to sit in this chair. I must just point that out because we have tried. What's going on here? Because the Observer is suggesting that there is a progressive pact in Berkshire in a bid to oust Tories. What's going on there?
Yeah, it's saying, I think Bracknell, which is a Tory-held council, that the Lib Dems, the Greens and Labour have formed some pacts, so they're not standing in certain wards, basically to try and oust the Tories. And I suppose the big question is, will this be replicated at a general election? I mean, people kind of forget that Keir Starmer has got a huge electoral mountain to climb. I think he's got to get 120 seats. Very difficult to do it in one cycle. And it would be interesting to see, like, will they form a pact with the Lib Dems? Now, Ed Davey's been on the broadcast airways this morning. He has not ruled out a pact with Labour, and I could see a situation where potentially Lib Dems only really properly fight 100 seats at the election. They'll probably put up paper candidates in some of these seats. But if you think about it, in some of the potential kind of red wall seats where, you know, some of the Lib Dem votes could go to Labour, and similarly probably in the southwest and in some of the Surrey seats, say Dominic Raab seat, which is vulnerable to Lib Dems.
Will he even stand again?
I suspect he won't. I suspect that may well go Lib Dem in the next cycle, that they do an unofficial pact to get over the line.
But then Starmer will be emboldened by the poor performance of the SNP, which is currently imploding. You know, Humza Yousaf is nicknamed Humza Useless up there. So they're going to be wanting to win at least 10 seats in Scotland, which will help them over the line in Westminster, won't it?
Yeah, I mean, I've seen figures of up to 20 they may benefit from in Scotland. But yeah, you're right. They will be emboldened by that, but still very difficult. And I think if the economy comes back by the time of the next general election, and let's remember, it's Labour's Achilles heel, I still think you could see a 92 situation where the Tories scrape over the line. Starmer, it remains, is very untested. We've not seen him in a campaigning kind of environment, and I don't think he's particularly light on his feet, particularly agile. Don't think he shines at PMQ, so I think the jury is still out on him. There
was some polling, wasn't there, to ask people what was the phrase that they thought of first when they were asked about Labour, and it was "don't know."
Well, exactly. So what does he stand for? What's the big idea? We still don't know. And it's not really like a 1997 situation where he's sort of riding this huge wave of
he's not Blair, is he?
Exactly.
This
popular
92
opinion.
and 97 demarcation is interesting. Let's go to 2019 and remember the man who did get the Tories over the line with an 80-seat majority, Boris Johnson. Now, there's a new book out by Anthony Selden. Funnily enough, we're having him on the show next week, so really interested to hear the nitty-gritty of what he's found out. What I found interesting about the Sunday Times, which is serialising this piece, and they've put the headline "Trapped in the COVID bunker," talking about Boris Johnson's handling or mishandling of the pandemic, is the fact that Michael Gove has gone on the record to talk to Selden in this book, not casting Boris in a particularly good light. And of course, who's he banging the drum for? Dominic Cummings.
Yeah, I mean, this book, so far, I think there's been 2 sort of extracts in the Times, and the Sunday Times paints a picture of utter dysfunction in Number 10. You know, it's run like a medieval court. I think the latest extract today talks about the breakdown of the relationship between Johnson and Cummings, but also between Matt Hancock as well, about how they tried to circumnavigate him by appointing external people coming in, how Cummings tried to keep Johnson out of certain meetings. So I have to say, with all this, really, you know, for Politico, it's really gripping reading. But is anyone remotely surprised? We all know that Boris sort of governed in a chaotic way, and now it's been borne out and played out and been, you know, in this book. Finally,
Giles, do you think it was a mistake for the Tories to oust Boris Johnson? I mean, how do you think Rishi's doing?
I think he's been doing not badly. He's certainly calmed things down. He's very much a technocratic approach. But what we haven't seen from him yet is the big idea. What does he stand for? We've got the 5 pledges, which all make sense, but what's the big overarching vision, you know, to deal with this level of disruption and what's going on in society? So I think we've still got to see that. But as I said, I think he's helped by the fact that he's got an opposition leader who is eminently beatable.
Indeed so. Thank you very much indeed, Giles Kenningham, for joining me this morning.
Thank you.